Ezras Hashem, today's daf is Masechta. Hi, Sheldon. Today's Sheldon. Hi, we just began.
Okay,
Uh,
thank you.
Beginning. Very good. Today's daf, Ezras Hashem, is Avodah Zarah, daf Chaf Aleph, number 21. And we're going to start from daf Chaf Amud Beis. And it's going to be about just before where the lines get wide on the page. So the Gemara says over here, Parabbanan, rabbis taught, Vinishmarta mikoil davara. The pasuk says a person should be careful from doing something bad. It doesn't say what, right? It just gives you an overall statement. So we darshan shelo yaharher odam bayam biyavi l'dei tuma b'layla. Hi, Alan. We just began. We're in the Chaf Amud Beis still. It says that a person should not have evil thoughts during the daytime, so that he will come to an emission at night. So it seems that it's Issa Daraisa to have an emission for no reason. Mekan, not in the act of intimacy. Mekan Amra Pinchas Ben Yair. From the fact that we say that a person should be careful that one thing leads to another, right? One thing leads to another. So therefore, it works in the other direction as well. Good things lead to other good things. Mekan Amra Pinchas Ben Yair taught us. Torah mivia lidei zehiras. If a person learns Torah, it brings him to being careful, which means that a person knows how to learn, so he knows what's prohibited. Because if you're not going to learn Torah, you don't know what's prohibited. So that's the first thing. Zehiras, bivia l'dei zrizas. Once someone knows what's prohibited, that brings him to diligence, so that he will put up safeguards so he doesn't violate the prohibition. Zrizas, being diligent about something, mevia l'dei nikias, that makes you totally clean, which means that you don't even have accidental shogegs or something like that, because you're so pure, you're so clean from you make it almost impossible for yourself to do an avera. Nikias mevia l'dei precious. Once a person has cleaned himself, that he doesn't have any averas, then that brings him to separation, which means that even from things that you're permitted to do, you abstain from doing. It doesn't work that way. You abstain and then you keep the Torah. First, you have the Torah, and then that leads you to just not pursue things even that you're permitted to have. Precious mivia l'dei tahara. Once a person is a parush, that means he's separate from even normal things. He just is limited. He doesn't overeat. He doesn't overdrink. He just uses the world just to stay alive, but he's not indulged in anything. That brings a person l'dei tahara, to have pure thoughts. That means that's not just being clean of Avera. He has no complaints against God, so to speak. He's really pure and connected. And Tahara, Mivea Anava. Once somebody's pure, it lead him to have total humility, because the greatness of God, and that everything that you have is a gift from God, and that even between you and your friend, perhaps that person is even greater than you. So that brings to humility. And once you have humility, another and once you have humility, it brings you to the fear of sin, that you even have afraid of the idea of a sin, what it does to your soul. And yiras hachet mevila day ruach hakodesh. And once you have yiras hachet, it brings you to the presence of God. And ruach hakodesh mevila day tchias hamesim. And once you have the presence of God, you could actually bring about the resurrection of the dead. It brings you a certain power to yourself. The Chasidis Gedolim Mekulan Chasidis is the greatest thing. Shnema, where you do things even uh, more than you're required to do. Shnema, the pasuk says, "Oz dibarta b'chazorin lechasidecha." At that time, you spoke in a prophecy, and the highest compliment you give a person is calling him La chasidecha. We don't call him the humble one. We don't call him the fearful one. The chassid is the highest one. But upligid Rabbi Shua Levi, the Amar Rabbi Shua Levi, this argued against Rabbi Shua Levi because anava gedolim makulam. The highest compliment you could give a person is calling him humble. I don't know why, but the highest compliment they gave Moshe Rabbeinu was that he was humble. But he brings another pasuk. Shnema ruach Hashem elikim Allah yar moash oisi levaser anavim. So the Mashiach is had the ruach Hashem so he can give the good news to anavim, to the humble ones. Chasidim loy nemar el anavim. Holamadu, this teaches you she'anava gedolim mekulam. Is humility is the highest compliment. So the question that the Gemara had: what is the highest compliment you could give a tzaddik? The highest compliment either is humble, or the highest compliment is a chassid. Says the Gemara: Ein meicher lehem. Mishnah said that, of course, you're not allowed to sell a tree to a guy, right? Because we have this concept of you're not allowed to sell something that's connected to the ground in Eretz Yisrael to a guy. Lo yisachanein. So, but what happens if you cut the tree down? Then you're allowed to sell it to him. What happens if you sell him a tree and you told him cut it down? So, Tarim Rabbanim tart. You can sell a tree to a guy on the condition that he was going to cut it down. So you don't necessarily have to cut it down for him. You can sell him the tree, but the condition in the contract is that he cuts it down. Rabbi Yehuda says that's a valid, you're allowed to do that. Meir says, you cannot sell him anything unless it's cut down already. Only if it's cut down. Shachas is, let's say, wheat that's produce. Let's say wheat that did not yet grow into its ripening yet. It's just started to grow. You're allowed to sell it to him amanas ligzois on the condition that he's going to cut it down right away. V'goises, and he cuts it down right away. The Rabbi Yehuda, you cannot sell him the shachas unless it's already cut down. Let's say you have standing wheat. Right, ripened wheat. Rabbi Yehuda says, "Amnas liktzar the koitzid." The Rabbi Yehuda, you could sell it to him on the condition that he's going to cut it down, and he cuts it down. Rabbi Meir says you could only sell it to him if it's cut down. So we see the same machlokes repeated over and over again. Whereas Rabbi Meir says that you can't sell him anything connected to the ground, and Rabbi Yehuda says, "Wait a second, you could sell it to him." That if it's connected to the ground, but you have to stipulate in the sale contract that he has to cut it down right away. And we need this machlekes repeated 3 times. Yashmi Elon, if we would just say the machlekes by the tree, I would think you b'hakam Rameir. And this Rameir says that it has to be cut from the ground. Kevin the loipasid mashalek. Since even if you're going to stipulate a condition, the guy may not follow through and cut it down. But if you're going to sell him tvua that's ripened, like wheat that's ripened already, he's going to cut it down right away. Because if he keeps it connected to the ground, it's gonna become spoiled. It's going to lead to a loss. So he's going to cut it down. Maybe he would agree to Rabbi Yehuda that you could sell it to him. If we just say by comma and by tree, we don't know if it gets better. By shachas, if it sure gets better. If you leave it in the ground and connect it to the ground, it'll ripen. So I would think I would think that Reb Meir would agree that Rabbi Yehuda would agree to Reb Meir that you have to sell it to him only if it's cut and not trust him that he's going to cut. Would just say by shachas, I would say only there Reb Meir says you don't trust him. By tree and by comma, maybe he agreed to Rabbi Yehuda. That's why you have to have this machlekes repeated in 3 situations, 3 scenarios. Now we learned previously that you're not allowed to sell a large animal to a goy because you might do Isser on Shabbos, even if the goy is going to buy the entire animal. We learned this last week. So the question is, Ibayalahu, let's say, according to Rabbi Yehuda, behema al manash l'shchait. Let's say I sell him this large animal, but I stipulate in the condition to the goy that he should shecht it right away. So, Mahu, would our Rabbi Yehuda say that it's a good sale? Hosam time in Maisha Rabbi Yehuda by the tree. Why did Rabbi Yehuda say it's permitted to sell him a tree connected to the ground with the condition that he's going to cut it down? The la b'shusa kaime v'loy matzi mashlei. It's not, the tree will remain in the Jew's possession, and therefore on the Jew's property. So the goy is not going to delay not cutting it down, because the Yid is going to call him up and say, listen, you got to cut it down right away. So ava behema, if you sell him a whole animal and keep him the b'shusei goy kaima, since the goy walks away with the entire behema, mashaleh, maybe he's not going to shecht it right away and he's going to keep it, and you're going to violate selling a live large animal to a goy. Or Rabbi Yehuda doesn't make a difference. If you stipulate in the contract, you could trust the goy, he's going to follow through on the contract. Tashma, come in here, the Tanya, we learned to the Baraisa, behema manas lishchot v'shoichet tiv Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says clearly, you could sell an animal with the condition that he shechts, and you got to trust that he's going to shecht, and that's okay. So says Rabbi Yehuda. Now we go to the next Mishnah. Ein maskir, we know you're not allowed, again, you're not allowed to sell a house to a guy. A house, you own a house in Israel, don't sell it to a guy. What about renting? So renting, you could say, if I allowed you to rent to a guy, right, you might come to sell to the guy. So the Reb Meir says, Ein maskir lehem bottom Eretz Yisrael. We don't rent to a guy a house in Eretz Yisrael. The ein tzorach loyma sodes, and for sure you can't rent the field to a guy. Now, the field, you're going to violate two problems with a field. Actually, if you sell a field to a guy, there's two problems. Number one, you're selling him a piece of real estate, and number two, if you sell a field to a guy, you're taking away from the economy of the Jewish people, because that field is now exempt from Trumas and Meisers. So certainly, if we don't allow you to rent to a house in Israel to a guy, because you might come to sell it, we're certainly not going to allow you to rent a field to a guy, because you might come to sell a field to a guy. Uba Syria, let's say Syria. Syria is a very interesting place, because David HaMelech, on his own, without asking permission, went ahead and captured Syria. So the question was, does it have a din of Eretz Yisrael? We're going to learn that Reb Meir holds Syria is like Israel proper. So it should have the same laws as Israel, right? It has the same Kedusha. But we go a little bit lenient. With Syria, Reb Meir goes, we go to the top of Chaf Aleph, Maskirin lehem bottom, you're allowed to rent a house to a guy in Syria, right? Or Maskirin lehem bottom, avaloi sadis, but you can't rent fields to them. So renting to a house, to a goy in Syria is permitted. We're not going to be guys, or you might come to sell it, but a field not. What about something like in America? So then there's no problem. We're allowed to sell houses, but umaskirin sadis, we could only rent fields to them. Why can't I only rent a field to a guy? Why can't in New York I can sell a field to a guy? According to a mayor, because I might come to sell the field to a guy in America, and if I allow myself to sell fields in America, I might come to sell a field for a guy in Eretz Yisrael. Divrei mayor. And selling a field to a guy in Eretz Yisrael is a double violation. Number one, you're selling him a piece of real estate, and number two, you're taking away from the Jewish economy. So Rabbi Meir is very strict. Rabbi Yossi says a little lenient. In Eretz Yisrael, maskirin lehem bottom. We're allowed to rent to a guy in Eretz Yisrael. You're allowed to rent him a house. If you own a house in Israel, you could rent it to him. Avaloi b'sadis, don't rent him a field, because if you rent him a field, you might come to sell the field to a guy. So that's in Eretz Yisrael. Uba Syria, we go one step lenient. Moichrim bottom, you're allowed to even sell a house to a guy. Now why? Because Rabbi Yossi holds Syria has no kedusha of Israel. So there's no isser to sell a house to a guy. So you certainly could sell a house to a guy, and of course you could rent a house to a guy. But umaskirin sada, you can only rent fields, because if I allowed you to rent a field if I allowed you to sell a field to a guy In Syria, you might come to sell a field to a guy in Eretz Yisrael. Uva chutz laaretz, no prohibition. In America, no problem. Moichrun elu ve'elu. You're allowed to sell anything you want. You're allowed to sell a field to a guy. You're allowed to sell a house to a guy. No problem. That's Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Now, now the Mishnah says, according to a mayor, even if they allowed you to rent. You see, in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to rent a house. I said, Rabbi Meir allowed you in Syria to rent a house to a guy, right? You go a little lighter. So we allow you to rent a house in Syria for a guy. It's not that the goy can use the house to live in there. That's not why. They didn't allow you to rent the house for a goy that he should use it for sleeping purposes, that it's his private home. What else is he renting the house? He should rent the house to store things in it, to use it for storage. Why? Because if you allowed him to rent it for his own personal living, he's going to bring into that house an avodah zarah. And it's still your house, so to speak, midrabanan, right? So even though you rented it and he can do whatever he wants with the house, he can bring in an avodah zarah. And Shenema, the pasuk says, you should not bring an avodah zarah into your house. So Mishnah says that we don't allow you to rent a house to a guy that he's going to live there, because he's going to bring an avodah zarah into the house, and that's your house. Your over the love, don't bring any abomination into your house. Now says the Mishnah. Mishnah says like this: the halacha is that you're now allowed to tell a guy to do work for you on Shabbos. That's a halacha. I'm not allowed to tell a guy to do work because that's considered as if I'm doing the work on Shabbos. So I can't tell a guy, oh, go, cook something for me on Shabbos, or go turn on the light. The same thing, you're not allowed to rent a merchatz to a guy. Now, if you rent your bathhouse to a guy, and the bathhouse is being heated with water, so who's going to make the profits of this bathhouse? The guy. But not everybody knows that. Everybody's going to think that the guy works for you. And it looks like you're working on Shabbos using a guy, keeping the store open on Shabbos. It looks like it's your bathhouse. It looks like the profits is going to you, and therefore you cannot rent him a bathhouse. Now, why did we say we can't sell a field to a guy, and you can't rent a field to a guy? Because there are two averas by a field. Because by selling a field to a guy, you're selling him a piece of real estate. Once you sell a field to a guy, not only that, you're taking money out of the economy, because there's no more trumas and maisis on that field. If that's the case, by a house. When you sell a house to a guy, we should be just as strict by houses. Don't sell houses, or don't rent houses to a guy, even in Syria. Why? Because you're doing two averas. Chada chanias karka, because you're selling him a piece of real estate. V'chada the kamafkele mezuzah, because now the house is parted from a mezuzah. Because once you sell a house to a guy, the house belongs to the guy, and therefore it's parted from mezuzah. As long as it belongs to a Jew, it's chayiv mezuzah. Mezuzah is not the obligation of the house; it's the obligation of the owner who's living there in the house. And therefore, when you sell a house to a guy, you're not uprooting a mitzvah over here of the house not being able to perform the mitzvah. However, when it comes to trumas and maasros, the maaser itself is because it grows. The kedusha of the produce grows from the ground, and once you sell that produce to a guy, it removes the holiness of that, and it's pater for maaser. So it's worse to sell a field than to sell a house. When selling a house, you're over one avera. Selling a house to a guy, you're selling him real estate. When you're selling a field, you're doing another avera. Not only selling him real estate, but you're also excluding him from maaser. You're taking money out of the economy. Now, the Rab Meir says, Besuria maskirim bottom. Surya, Rab Meir went light. He said, you're allowed to rent houses there. Why not? Why can't I sell a house in Surya? Because I might come sell a house in Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, I can't sell a house in Syria. Yihachi, for a mayor, is that correct? Mischiris nami nigzar. Let us say that you shouldn't rent the house because you may come to sell a house in Syria. And if you come to sell a house in Syria, you might come to sell a house in Eretz Yisrael. So you'll have we should not allow you to rent a house in Syria because you might come to sell the house in Syria, and if you sell a house in Syria, we might lead you to sell houses in Israel. Answers the Gemara, he gifa gzera, vanam nekim v'nigza gzera l'gzera. The fact of renting a house is a gzera, and we might come to sell a house. Then we'll make another house in Syria. And then you make another gzera that just because we allow you to sell houses in Syria, you might come to sell a house in Eretz Yisrael. It's too much removed. Says the Gemara, then why is it we don't allow you to rent in Syria? Why did Rabbi Meir say on top of the page, maskir in Syria, maskir in Lam bottom, you're allowed to rent in Syria a house to a goy, avaloi sodus, you're not allowed to rent a field. Why? It's the same double derivative. You might come to sell the field in Syria, and if you sell a field in Syria, you might come to sell it in Eretz Yisrael. So the answer is, and this is what we spoke out in the Mishnah, Ksavar, Rameir holds kibush yochad shmei kibush. When David HaMelech captured Syria, it had din kedushas of Eretz Yisrael. So Syria is like Eretz Yisrael itself. And yet, we're not going to make it as strict as Eretz Yisrael. So did the Ispeitarte, when you sell a field in Eretz Yisrael and in Syria, you're doing two averis of selling property and taking money out of the economy. So Gazer Rabbanan, the Rabbanan did not allow you to rent the field in Syria. Bought them the less botarte, but houses that they didn't have two averas, just has one avera, and not many people still lived in Syria, even though David HaMelech conquered it. Like Gazer Rabbanan, the Rabbanan didn't ask you from renting in Syria. But selling in Syria, you're not allowed to sell in Syria because Rabbi holds kibush yochad shmei kiddush. Eretz Syria is like Israel. But chutz la'aretz, Rameir said, you're not allowed to rent a field. You're allowed to rent a field to a guy. You're allowed to sell a field to a guy, but you can only rent a field to a guy in chutz la'aretz. Okay? So what we can explain what does Rameir hold? Why in America I can't sell a field to a guy? So the isbei tarto goes rabbanim. I'm not allowed to sell a field in America because I might come. I'm not allowed to sell a field in America because I might come to sell a field in Eretz Yisrael, and that's big avera because there's two averas selling a field in Eretz Yisrael. So Rabbanan made a gzera, don't sell a field in Chutz La'aretz. Bought them tarta, but selling houses in Chutz La'aretz, even in Eretz Yisrael, there's only one avera. Legazer Rabbanan didn't make a gzera not to sell houses in Chutz La'aretz. Rabbi Yossi be'eretz Yisrael maskirin lehem bottom. So we're going to say matama sodas disbitarti gazer rabbanim bottom to less bitarti like gazer rabbanim. So we always go lenient on houses. So in Eretz Yisrael, Rabbi Yossi holds you're allowed to rent them because even if you sell them a house in Eretz Yisrael, you're going to only be over one avera. A field, we're not going to let you rent in Eretz Yisrael because if you're going to come to sell a field in Eretz Yisrael, you're going to be over to averis. Over Syria, Meichrin, you're allowed to sell a field. You're allowed to sell. You're allowed to sell even a house in Syria. Why are you allowed to sell a house in Syria? Kasavar kibush yochad loishme kibush. Rabbi Yosef holds that Syria has no kedusha. It's like chutz la'aretz. So therefore, you're allowed to sell a house in Syria. So why can't I sell a field in Syria according to Rabbi Yosef? A house has two problems to it. So therefore, a field that has two problems to it. So Rabbanim said, don't sell fields in Syria because you might come to sell a field in Eretz Yisrael. Bottom the less beitarta, but houses that only in Eretz Yisrael there's no two averis. Like the Rabbanim didn't make a gzera in Syria not to sell houses. And in America, you're allowed to sell fields and houses in America. My tama, kivan de merechak, like Azrin. Since America is far away from Israel, I'm not going to make a gzera. I'm not going to say, oh, don't sell your house in Chutz La'aretz because you might come to sell your house in America, in Israel. We're not going to make such a gezerah. Amar Rav Yehuda Mashmua, halacha Rabbi Yossi. Halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. Amar Rav Yossi. Rabbi Yossi said, you're not allowed to sell, you're allowed to sell your house, on Lawrence. Make sure that you don't sell it to three goyim. The Kama Shkuna, don't make a neighborhood. You're allowed to sell one house to a guy. But if you own three houses, you can't sell all three to a guy, because then you're forming a Goyish neighborhood within a Jewish neighborhood. Tana, we learned in a Braita, a neighborhood is not less than three people. Says the Gemara, now, why am I allowed to sell one property to a guy? We could have this problem. Let us always be concerned that if you sell one property to a guy, the guy is going to turn it around and divide it up into three properties. And he's going to sell 2/3 of his property to two other guys. So every time you sell a property to a guy, he has potential to turn it and sell it to two other goyim. So now you have three people on your former property, and you're making a shchuna, a neighborhood of goyim within a neighborhood of Jews. Amar Abai said, "Alifnei mapkidim, alifnei mapkidim." We can only be careful you doing the aveira itself, but a second derivative already is too far removed, and therefore we're not going to make exeret. You're not going to sell your house to a guy because he might divide it up. We're not. It's too far removed to make exeret. Now we said, "B'mokam sharmu lahaskim mechlal de'ikaduch l'loy migrate." We go to Amud Beis. The stomach Rav Meir, the Rabbi Yossi b'chol dukri migrate. The Stam Mishnah holds like Rav Meir, and Rav Meir holds that in Eretz Yisrael you can't rent, but in Chutz La'aretz, in Syria you could rent houses. That's the Mishnah. The Stam Mishnah is Rav Meir. Now we're going to do the final. Another minute, we'll stop. V'chol mokam leyiskar. You're not allowed to rent a bathhouse to a guy. Why not? Because again, if the guy is going to use it and open up shop in your bathhouse, even though he's keeping the profits, people think he works for you. And then you're going to be, it looks like you're Michal Shabbos keeping the guy working in your store on Shabbos. Tanya, we learned in the Brisa, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Oima, LaYiskar Adam Merkotzer LeGoy, Ibnei Shnikra Al Shmoy. You're not allowed to rent your bathhouse to a guy because it's called your bathhouse. The guy This guy is going to do work on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and your bathhouse is open on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Nobody's going to know that you rented to the guy. They're going to think that you hired the guy to work for you. Aval kusi mai, but a kusi who's like a quasi ger. So you're mai shari. It's permitted because the kusi is not going to keep it open on Shabbos and Yom Tov. He knows it says in the Torah, don't open on Shabbos, so it's not going to be open on Shabbos. But he might work on Chalamayid. But I could work also on Chalamayid. Kusi might keep the bathhouse open on Chalamayid. And it looks like I'm keeping the bathhouse open in Chalamayid, but we're also allowed to work on Chalamayid to keep a bathhouse open, because it's not so hard to keep a bathhouse open in Chalamayid because it's just heating up water. Now, one more point, and then we'll stop. Avol sodehu legoy mai. You're not allowed to You're allowed to rent your field to a guy. I'm allowed to rent my field to a guy. It's permitted. Only a bathhouse, my tama, because when you rent your field to a guy, arise covered. He's working as a sharecropper. So everybody knows that the guy is doing the work and keeping the profits for himself. And maybe he's giving some of the profits to the owner, but it's really the guy working on his own behalf. So the Gemara asks, so merchatz nami amri, why don't people say that by a merchatz? Arise covered, that he's working on his own behalf and he's keeping some of the profits for himself. And really he's not doing it on behalf of the owner. And says the Gemara, the final answer. It's such a low profit margin business, opening a bathhouse. Generally, people don't rent bathhouses. So if you rent a bathhouse, most people think that he's working for you. And therefore, people are going to think that you're violating keeping your bathhouse open on Shabbos, and this is just a worker of yours. But fields, generally, people do share cropping with fields. And therefore, if they see the guy working on your fields, they know that he's working on his own behalf and not that he's working on your behalf. And therefore, it would be permitted. Okay, stop over here.